Late June 1945 was a stifling presence over the British Field Hospital, located precariously close to the recently secured crossings of the Rhine River. The air hung heavy with heat, tension, and the aftermath of relentless fighting. Before we dive deeper, every day we make videos like this, so be sure to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Back to the scene. Large canvas tents were saturated with wet earth, antiseptic, and the faint coppery tang of blood. Into this relentless world of wartime triage, Greta Weber was delivered. Barely 19 years old, she was the sole silent survivor pulled from a German anti-aircraft battery overrun just before the first break of dawn. 2 exhausted British medics carried her in on a rough stretcher. Her uniform was tattered, stiff with dried blood, dark river mud, and pulverized concrete dust. Her face was pale and mask-like, and she made no sound. She was locked in a state of catatonic shock, frozen by terror since the moment of her capture. Around her, the medical tent was an epicenter of pandemonium, overflowing with pain, urgency, and desperation. Wounded British soldiers were packed tightly onto cots and the floor. Doctors shouted for plasmatypes and sterilized instruments, while the suffocating miasma of carbolic acid battled the sickly odor of untreated infection. At the busy triage station worked Corporal Thomas Hayes, a weary 23-year-old medic from London. Weeks of non-stop casualties had sharpened his skills while hardening his emotions into something protective and distant. Beneath his calm efficiency lay a personal history. His Jewish relatives had been forced to flee Hamburg in 1937, a memory that quietly shaped every decision he made amid the chaos of war and survival. When Thomas knelt beside Greta's stretcher, her reaction was immediate. She recoiled violently, trying to shrink into the canvas, her eyes wide with a raw, primal fear that transcended politics, uniforms, and nationality. Drawing on the German dialect his grandmother had taught him, Thomas spoke slowly and gently. He assured her that he was only there to help, that no harm would come to her under his care. Her reply was a single whisper, barely audible, instantly swallowed by the tent's constant roar. As Thomas began cutting away her blood-soaked uniform, he discovered crude, self-made bandages layered tightly around her torso. They were fashioned from torn scraps of fabric, all dark with dried blood. When he finally peeled back the last layer, the sight before him forced him to stop, breath caught in his chest. A massive, jagged shrapnel wound slashed diagonally across her lower back and flank. It was days old, badly infected, crawling with maggots performing a gruesome natural cleansing. The surrounding flesh was necrotic, discolored in sickening shades of black, grey, and green. Even Thomas, seasoned by every form of battlefield trauma, was momentarily paralyzed by the severity of it. That she was still conscious defied logic. Greta turned her head away, bracing for disgust or hatred. Instead, Thomas shouted for morphine plasma and the senior surgical officer, his voice sharp and commanding. He covered her with a clean wool blanket and rested his hand on her uninjured shoulder, steady and protective. In firm German, he promised, "We will make everything right now." Captain Richard Norton arrived, assessed the wound, and dismissed the case instantly. She was beyond hope, he said, and their limited resources had to be reserved for British soldiers, not enemy combatants. Thomas stood his ground. Calm but unwavering, he argued that the 19-year-old had endured this injury for days, her will to live demanding moral intervention beyond military protocol. Norton hesitated, torn between duty and conscience. Thomas did not wait. He administered morphine, started an IV line, and began cleaning the wound with his own gloved hands. For 4 grueling hours, Thomas and Norton worked side by side. They removed dead tissue, flushed the cavity with antiseptic, and packed it with sulfur powder as Greta drifted in and out of drugged consciousness. She muttered broken German phrases about fire and burning as the morphine pulled her under. By 2 in the morning, the surgery was finally complete, and against all odds, her life had been preserved. She had lost significant muscle and required adjustments to her hip, but she was alive. Thomas stayed at her bedside through the long night, changing dressings, monitoring her pulse, and giving her small sips of water. At dawn, pale light filtered through the canvas. Greta opened her eyes and stared at Thomas, still seated beside her cot. The terror was gone, replaced by a searching, fragile clarity. She whispered if he had truly touched the filth and corruption of her wound. Thomas smiled gently and told her that he had, and that it had not harmed him in any way. That reassurance broke something open inside her. She began to weep quietly. Tears of pain and relief mingled together. Thomas took her trembling hand and held it until she calmed. Over the next 3 weeks of recovery, Thomas devoted nearly all his free time to her care. His actions became a quiet rebellion against hatred and the cruelty of war. He secured better rations for her, taught her simple English phrases, and shared gentle stories of his childhood in London. Slowly, she began to trust him. In return, Greta shared fragments of her life in Hamburg before war destroyed it. When the infection was finally contained and she could sit upright, she asked for a mirror. She studied the jagged scar across her back, preparing for his revulsion. Instead, Thomas told her it was not a mark of shame, but a symbol of survival she should carry with pride. Weeks later, as he changed her dressing, Greta spoke plainly, "You are Jewish." Thomas confirmed it with a nod, and she stared at him, absorbing the truth of what that meant. She spoke quietly but firmly, saying that a Jewish man had saved the life of a German girl. Tears filled her eyes as she confessed the poisonous lies she had been taught about Jewish people. She admitted she had been told they were inhuman, destined to commit terrible acts against Germany. Thomas met her gaze calmly, without anger or accusation. He explained that some people, regardless of race or belief, choose darkness, while others choose good. On that day, in that place, he had chosen to do good. His duty was saving lives. Thomas continued visiting for another month. He brought contraband American comics translated into German and taught her English curse words that made them both laugh until their wounds ached. She taught him playful Bavarian slang, and together they formed an unexpected bond across enemy lines. Laughter became a quiet act of resistance against the war surrounding them. At night, when phantom pain returned, Thomas sat by her cot, reading or telling stories of London, British history, and food, anchoring her until sleep finally came. One evening she asked why he came every day, risking punishment and exhaustion. Thomas paused before answering, weighing the truth carefully. He said the worst sickness he saw was not her wound, but the spiritual rot in the world, the ideology that tried to convince her she was worthless and deserved to die unseen. Saving her life was his way of affirming her humanity and his own. She listened, and in her eyes, the shadow of war finally began to lift. On the morning of her transfer to a distant prisoner hospital, Greta made one final request. She asked to hold his metal identification tags just for a moment. She pressed the cold metal tags to her lips, a silent vow of remembrance and respect. The ambulance waited nearby, engine rumbling, dust curling in the warm air as nurses prepared her transfer far behind the lines. Thomas watched quietly, in silence. So solemn, he never saw Greta Weber again. Yet every year on June 23rd, a postcard arrived for Thomas Hayes, mailed from somewhere in Germany, unsigned. It carried one perfect, carefully written sentence in English, a lasting reminder of her gratitude and the touch that saved her. "The fire doesn't burn anymore, and thank you for your touch." Each word on the card resonated deeply. Thomas kept every postcard, letting them remind him that compassion, even across enemy lines, could create a bridge between lives scarred by war and hatred. For over 50 years, this ritual continued. Each June 23rd, the card arrived, a tangible proof of the profound impact of one radical act of kindness, unmeasured by medals or recognition, but immortalized in the quiet, enduring connection between them. The fire had passed, yet its memory lingered. Greta's words, brief and simple, contained a universe of gratitude. They were proof that even in the darkest war, human compassion could transcend nationality, ideology, and the destructive lies that fueled hatred. Thomas reflected on the lesson he had learned. The greatest victories are not measured by battles won or enemies defeated, but by lives preserved, trust restored, and courage shown to act rightly in the face of fear and chaos surrounding him. Through decades, he taught this principle to his children. That true heroism was shown not by killing the enemy, but by saving them. That courage was often quiet, unrecognized, and yet immeasurably powerful in shaping hearts and lives far beyond the battlefield. He reminded them that kindness endures, and that memory was the only piece of war that truly lasts. Each act of compassion creates a ripple, often unseen but potent, leaving behind an inheritance of humanity stronger than weapons or ideology. And so, the touch of a hand, a gesture of mercy, carried its message through decades. That small, deliberate act had preserved life, healed trauma, and reshaped the understanding of both Thomas and Greta, proving that goodness survives even in the shadow of war. By teaching this lesson, Thomas ensured that the story of light over darkness would continue, that children would grow to understand that saving an enemy's life is the ultimate moral victory, a legacy that outlasts the clamor of battles and the bitterness of history. Years passed, the war faded into history, but the memory never loosened its grip. Thomas carried it quietly, never speaking of medals or heroism, only of a young woman whose life reminded him why humanity must survive even war. He understood that day had changed him permanently. In the face of brutality and indoctrinated hatred, one deliberate act of care had cut through everything, proving that morality does not belong to flags, but to individual choices.